I'd like to introduce James Masnov. James is a former stellar history student of ours, and he's going to speak to us. And I'm just I'll read a little introduction that even James suggested for us to kind of introduce the topic that James is going to talk to us about. And it says, James will discuss the various views concerning the role of history inside and outside of academia. And I think that points to a kind of paradigm called public history, obviously, that's catching on all over the country. We have a public sociology. Might have some parallels that's catching on too. Interesting. James will provide an analysis of two of the prevailing schools of historical thought. I understand one is called social history, the other is referred to as a master narrative. And he will argue for the idea that there is both a synthesis of these two schools and maybe some problems or some things to reject in these two schools of thought. So without further ado, as we say, let's hear James.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bray. Yes, I am James Masnov. I am an independent historian and a recent graduate of Western Oregon University. The talk today is called Public Memory and the Ownership of History. Talk in three parts, the first of which will be about the tension between popular history versus academic history. The second of which will be about the historical literacy of college graduates and some methods for discussing history for educators and for anybody really. And the third and final part of this talk will be about the current debate regarding controversial statues and memorials and a way for the public to reckon with history through these issues. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So part one, popular history versus academic history. It only seems reasonable to define our terms. And with that in mind, popular history is written for a general readership, non-historians, non-academics. It's promoted commercially through mainstream sources, including television talk shows, newspapers, and other traditional mainstream media. The authors are generally not PhDs or professors, but instead tend to be journalists, pundits, and even writers of fiction. These works are often used as the source material for TV shows, miniseries, and films. And they tend to lean traditional or even conservative. They have a habit of mythologizing, and they have a penchant for hero worship of their subjects, and they generally reinforce cultural assumptions. You're not likely to find any sort of like groundbreaking historical revisionism in a work of popular history. Academic history is written by historians, for historians, scholars, and students. It's promoted through academic circles, including conferences, academic journals, etc. Authors are PhDs who usually also teach at institutions of higher learning. There's a premium put on the use of primary sources, original documents, etc., and original scholarship. It builds upon a previous scholarship and contributes to a canon of historiography. For those of you not familiar with the term, historiography is essentially the history of the scholarship of that given field or subject. And in recent decades, much academic history has been rooted in social history, giving attention to the historically voiceless. And this form of history tends to lean toward a left of center political lens. And so the common sort of accusations that these two realms get is that popular history is not really much more than hero worship. You read a book of popular history, it's going to likely deify the subject in some way. But then there's also accusations against academic historians. The academic historians are essentially hipsters, looking down their noses at the general readership, and they have some sort of kind of elitist, exclusionary quality about them. And of course, these two characterizations are more caricatures, and as caricatures, they're too simple to be true. And nevertheless, I do think that each of these accusations have at least a kernel of truth to them. So to really look at popular history versus academic history, I thought it made sense to look at some specific examples. And we're going to look at some what I would consider positive examples of each, and some maybe not so great examples of each as well. And for what I would think of as a positive example of popular history is David McCullough's John Adams. This was published in the early 2000s. And chapter 1 opens with this passage, quote, "In the cold, nearly colorless light of a New England winter, two men on horseback traveled the coast road below Boston, heading north. A foot or more of snow covered the landscape, the remnants of a Christmas storm that had blanketed Massachusetts from one end of the province to the other. Beneath the snow, after weeks of severe cold, the ground was frozen solid to a depth of 2 feet. Packed ice in the road, ruts as hard as iron made the going hazardous, and the riders, mindful of the horses, kept at a walk, end quote. Now, as you can see, this is very narrative. It's not packed with a whole bunch of historical data, but it is nevertheless very compelling writing. It engages the reader. And a positive example, in my estimation, of academic writing, academic history, would be The Middle Ground by Richard White. And this is a passage taken from page 56 of that work. Quote, "Diplomatic negotiations and warfare, the large trading expeditions, these were the work of men. But the Frenchmen who appeared in Algonquin villages either traveled with Algonquin women or had liaisons with them there. Much of their petty trading was probably with women. The labor they purchased was usually that of women. On a day-to-day basis, women did more than men to weave the French into the fabric of a common Algonquin French life," end quote. So as you can see, academic history is more packed with data. It's not so much trying to tell you a story. It's not utilizing narrative as much as it's unfolding and revealing historical data to the reader. But now let's also look at some maybe not so good examples of each. And I thought for popular history, I would choose someone like Glenn Beck. Now, Glenn Beck calls himself America's historian. This is unfortunate. And it has nothing to do with his politics. It's because he's not a historian, and so he shouldn't be promoting himself as such. But here's an example from his book, Being George Washington. Quote, "Perhaps it would be the end of George Washington and of his revolution. Colonel Rawl certainly thought Washington was on the ropes. General Lee had thought so as well, and so, though he hated to admit it, did Thomas Paine. It was no comfortable Philadelphia print shop in which Paine now sat. Patriotism meant more than words to the English-born pamphleteer," end quote. So to me, the problem here is not so much that it's utilizing a narrative. That would be the least of the issues here, as far as I'm concerned. The problem is the writing itself. It's got a cartoonish, almost swashbuckling nature to it. One can almost see George Washington and Thomas Paine sprouting wings and ascending into the heavens. This is the sort of thing that gives popular history, in my estimation, a bad name. But let's not let academic writing off the hook. Now, when I was doing my research for this presentation, I was looking at some not so great examples of published academic writing, and I found some doozies, and it started to feel like shooting fish in a barrel. So I actually really held back, and I found an academic journal article that was published in 2009 in an article called Stance. The writer is Jason Huber. Quote, "Perhaps the most ubiquitous epistemic convention in the West, an entrenched remnant of Enlightenment science and philosophy, is the oppositional duality of objectivity and subjectivity. Any pursuit that involves emotions in any way is seen as epistemically less valuable or less true. This epistemic assumption is made manifest in the separation and hierarchization of the natural sciences and the social sciences and humanities. Just what is it that the West fears in attributing truth to subjective experiences and emotions? Why is objectivity more epistemically valid or for truth claims than subjectivity?" End quote. Whew. So I'm not using this example to critique the thesis, though I'm not a fan. It's just to take a look at the way it's written, and it's jargon-filled, it's very inside baseball, it's somewhat navel-gazing, and in terms of the jargon, he uses epistemic or epistemically 4 times in as many sentences. I find this to be an example that gives academic writing a bad name. So question is there a balance to be found between academic history and popular history? I actually believe, to some extent, that it can. And I think this has to do with finding a balance between historiography and narrative. Historiography is really the discipline of the academic historian, and they generally tend to be very reticent to utilize narrative to tell history as a story. And it makes sense why. So, as I said, historiography is the sort of history of the scholarship of that given field. What have previous historians had to say? And where have they agreed or disagreed? What have the debates been? What have the conversations been about this historical figure or event, etc.? And that makes sense that historians would concern themselves with such things. For one thing, you want to make sure that you're bringing something new to the table. And then I also understand the reticence of a narrative, because to utilize a narrative is to tell a story. And to tell a story is to say there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what telling a story is. And academic historians are understandably reticent to do something like that, because if you put something in the form of a story, an academic historian is going to say, well, yeah, you say this is the beginning, but there's all of these antecedents that predate this stuff that you're calling the beginning. And you say this is the end, but there's all of these ramifications that happened thereafter that you're not taking into account. Narrative has a tendency to encapsulate an event or a person's life, etc., and removes it from its historical context and puts it into a vacuum. So it makes sense that academic historians would be reticent to utilize narrative for that very reason. And yet, I do believe that academic historians could utilize just a touch of narrative in some of their writing, because while life is not a narrative, and so history is not a narrative, we think narratively. Human beings think episodically. And in fact, it's part of the human experience that one of the things that moves us most is the telling of story. And I think it makes sense then to not dismiss narrative entirely out of hand for academic historians. It's just a matter of degrees. That said, certainly popular historians have a lot to gain by utilizing historiography. Even some of the better popular writers of history, such as David McCullough, generally do not utilize historiography much at all. Their works would benefit greatly by utilizing historiography and saying, what have historians had to say about this figure, this event, etc. before. That's not to say that popular history can't be very well sourced. It can be, such as John Adams by David McCullough. It's very well sourced. It has a very rich bibliography. But McCullough's tendency to not bother to see what historians have over time had to say and where they disagreed about certain aspects certainly weakened popular history. By utilizing a little more historiography, popular history could really add some credibility to its realm, and it could really have a lot to gain by adding some academic rigor. I also wanted to note some irony in these two realms. And the irony is this, and I don't think it's insignificant. Popular history, while it tends to lean conservative, nevertheless has a sort of everyman populist sort of quality to it that academic history often lacks. And academic history, especially social history, which its mission is to give voice to the historically voiceless and to offer these new and alternative histories that people aren't as used to hearing, sometimes participants in that field betray their cause, in my opinion, by being elitist and exclusionary and looking down their nose at the general readership. So I do think the two have something to learn from each other. And I think that these ironies within the two are somewhat significant. And now, and so about popular history, I wanted to mention for a moment the work Hamilton. It's probably the best example of popular history entertainment in the past couple of years. It's been quite a phenomenon. And I want to be very clear that I'm actually a very big fan of LinManuel Miranda's work. One of my favorite things to do with my family during the summer is that when we're on extended road trips, we blast the Hamilton soundtrack and listen to it over and over. So I'm a very big fan of the work. It's based on Ron Chernow's book, Alexander Hamilton, which I was fortunate enough to read a few years before the Hamilton phenomenon. But it's a fantastic, very comprehensive piece of work, and I highly recommend it. But there does begin to be a question when you have a phenomenon like Hamilton, is to ask how much of it is history and how much of it is mere entertainment or even simply pop culture. I have to say that the academic historian in me tends to think it is certainly the latter, even though it is a wonderful piece of art. And I began to think about this as I've had conversations with college students in the past couple of years, and I actually had some intimate to me that they knew the history of the American Revolution and they knew the history of the early republic because they're fans of Hamilton. And I probably took this a little personally because I am an early Americanist. The American Revolution and the early Republic happens to be my field of scholarship. And so I started thinking about this more and more. I started thinking, well, if one were to get their history from Hamilton, what misconceptions might they derive from it? Well, for one, they could very easily make the mistake that Thomas Jefferson was the only founder to own slaves, as he is the absolute only founder in the entire play that's referenced it as a slave owner. Another concern that I have as an historian is the character of Alexander Hamilton himself. And there's a bit of hero worship in the Broadway musical, and perhaps that's somewhat inevitable in a work of popular history and popular history entertainment. But that's not to say that Alexander Hamilton is presented unblemished. He's shown to be prideful to a fault, to be ambitious to a fault. He's shown to have been a philanderer. And yet, one of the biggest concerns as to his character, which is certainly addressed by Ron Chernow in the book, but is entirely missing from the Broadway musical, is that Alexander Hamilton had a real penchant for militarism. He had some very Napoleon-like qualities. He had a penchant for empire and standing armies that even his contemporaries found a bit dangerous. And as an early Americanist, I must note that I find that just a little bit disappointing, because it certainly could have been included. But that's my personal take on that. Moving on to part 2 of this talk, I want to talk briefly, this is the briefest part of this talk, and it's the historical literacy of college graduates and then some methods for history. As I was thinking about the college students I've talked to over the past couple of years who seem to know the history of the early American Republic because they know the play Hamilton, it got me thinking, what really is the historical literacy of people in this country, but specifically of college graduates? I did some digging, and in my research I came across a study that was conducted in 2015. Its findings were published in 2016, and several hundred college graduates were polled of various disciplines, and they were all at least earners of bachelor's degrees. Some of them had earned advanced college degrees. And the results were rather disquieting, to say the least. In the publication called A Crisis in Civic Education, a report by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni in 2016, I'm going to share just a handful of the findings with you here. Among college graduates polled, 60% knew that Congress and not the president have the power to declare war. Not terrible, but not great. But only 38% knew that senators serve 6 years and representatives serve 2 years in office. 49% of college graduates polled knew that presidential impeachments are tried before the U.S. Senate. Only 45% knew the process for amending the Constitution. And amazingly, almost 10%, 9.6% of college graduates polled thought that Judge Judy sat on the Supreme Court. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. And there's a lot of questions that come out of this. You know, I was talking about academic historians earlier. It would be easy to think, well, this is the fault of the academic historians. After all, it's their day job to teach history to college students. And yet, I think that'd be a very unfair analysis, because it's also the fault of public educators, where young people are coming into college already unbelievably deficient in their historical literacy. So what can be done about this? I think a handful of things can be done. And this is for educators, but it's certainly for anybody, the biggest novice of history. If you just have a little bit of discipline in how you look at it and how you talk about it, doesn't matter who you are, these things could really make a difference. One is that historians are time travelers. And as time travelers, there's a certain responsibility and obligation to travel to the past and bring the past into the present and analyze it, disseminate it, and discuss the various interpretations that you're going to have. What one shouldn't do is travel to the past and impose your present-day worldview upon a completely different era. This is called presentism. Most historians know that it's wrong. A lot of them do it anyway. And certainly the general public is very guilty of this. it makes sense that you would use your own worldview, and therefore you would utilize some presentism when you analyze history. In fact, to some level, it's inevitable. Part of analysis is actually using your personal worldview to interpret data. So to that extent, it's going to happen, but that doesn't make it okay. All the more reason to keep it in check as much as humanly possible. I very much advocate for not committing the crime of presentism. And then I advocate for what I call the 3 C's of history: teach the complexities, emphasize the role of contingency, and promote the principle of context. Teach the complexities. It's the complex matters of history that make it fascinating. There aren't usually simple answers anyway, but certainly it's in the complexities that you find the really rich, interesting stuff about history. It's in the hypocrisies. It's in the contradictions of certain figures, certain eras, certain movements, etc. Emphasize the role of contingency. Nothing in history was inevitable. Nothing in history was inevitable, including this moment right now. And so the role of contingency is very important for people to understand. And promote the principle of context. As I was talking about context earlier, why academic historians are reticent to utilize too much narrative. Context is certainly fundamental. And I would also advocate that we communicate the critical nature of historical literacy. And again, this is across the board. This isn't just for educators. This is for any conversation you have with anybody that's remotely related to history. Historical literacy is incredibly important. So the third and final part of this talk is about current controversies regarding monuments and memorials. As many of you probably remember, and some of you might have talked about in your classes, this monument of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, there were protests regarding it last summer in Charlottesville, Virginia. A little bit of background. In 2016, the city of Charlottesville voted to have the monument removed. This decision was met with some legal action, and as of August of last summer, it was still in this spot. But it was nevertheless bound for removal. A sizable group of white supremacists descended on the town square of Charlottesville with torches in hand and chanting anti-Semitic remarks and staged their protest. That protest was met with a larger counter-protest, and tensions escalated. There were injuries, and even one woman, Heather Heyer, one of the counter-protesters, was struck by a vehicle and killed. The events in Charlottesville reignited and re-amplified an already ongoing debate over what to do about controversial monuments. In the wake of Charlottesville, a day or two later, President Trump made the slippery slope argument of, well, if we start removing these kind of monuments, then soon enough people are going to be calling for the removal of Jefferson and Washington. This comment was met with commentary by the media and members of the intelligentsia. And in fact, CNN on their website published an article where they consulted a number of historians to get their take. And one historian saw a difference between a Robert E. Lee statue and a George Washington statue. And she put it this way. Amy Greenberg said, quote, "One devoted over 25 years of his life to creating a republic the likes of which history had never known, and for his sacrifice gained the title father of his country. The other was a traitor," end quote. Now, I actually agree with Professor Greenberg's overall point. I too see a difference between monuments to the founders and monuments to the Confederacy, and I'd be more than happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. But I actually find this argument to be a terrible one, and maybe some of you see what I see. But historically speaking, George Washington was a traitor, right? George Washington was arguably the most famous traitor of the 18th century. He did, after all, lead a continental army that raised arms against its mother country, the British Crown. So I agree with her overall point, but find this specific argument to be a terrible one. Just my opinion. But about that slippery slope argument, it may not have been as ridiculous as one might think. A pundit for CNN, Angela Rye, said on the air on August 17th of last year, she said, quote, "George Washington was a slave owner. We need to call slave owners out for what they are. Whether we think they were protecting American freedom or not, he wasn't protecting my freedom. I wasn't someone, my ancestors weren't deemed human beings to him. To me, I don't care if it's a George Washington statue or a Thomas Jefferson statue or a Robert E. Lee statue. They all need to come down." Right around the same time, I happened to attend a talk at the Willamette Heritage Center in Salem. Just after this, August of last year. And I was an audience member, and they had a panel discussion about this very issue. And there was a woman on that panel making the same exact argument. So certainly these are debates that people have been having. And then we have this Roger Tawney statue in Maryland. This memorial was removed just after the events in Charlottesville. This Roger Tawney monument had been debated, like all of these. There had been debates going on for some time about its removal, but it appears that the events in Charlottesville really provoked the city of Annapolis, Maryland, where this is located in front of the State House, to make the removal happen much sooner. Reporting on this event in an article online by the Smithsonian, a writer wrote this, quote, "The Tawney Memorial is the latest in a string of Confederate monuments that have been taken down across the country," end quote. I must tell you, I found this, quote, "astounding," because Roger Tawney was not a member of the Confederacy. Roger Tawney was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the 1850s. He wrote the majority opinion in what is the most egregious Supreme Court decision of all time, which is really saying something, Dred Scott, where Tawney stated that African Americans were never intended to be citizens of the United States, that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States, and that neither the state nor the federal government, states or federal government, had any power to stop the institution of slavery. That was in 1857 and helped to lead to the Civil War. So, was Roger Tawney a racist? Yep. Did he defend slavery? Yes, but he was not a Confederate. He didn't leave the bench when the Civil War broke out to go and side with the South. He stayed on the bench until he died of natural causes in 1864, when the war was only a year away from ending. There's a real danger here in conflating and adding to the distortion, conflating someone like Roger Tawney with the Confederacy. And the danger is that it makes one overlook the racism of the US federal government and the Union North. Kind of a big deal. And again, I was astounded that this was published by the Smithsonian. And then we have the University of Virginia, which, as you may know, is also in Charlottesville. And they have a number of monuments to Thomas Jefferson on their campus. As with the Roger Tawney memorial statue, at UVA, there have been debates for decades now about whether or not to remove images and statues of Thomas Jefferson. And actually, just last month, 2018 of this year, this statue, it was tagged with racist and rapist. The thing is that it's no small complication that Thomas Jefferson was the founder and creator of the University of Virginia. And he wasn't some detached benefactor. He didn't simply leave a bunch of money in his will for the creation of this university. He didn't simply write a check. Thomas Jefferson designed the most famous structures. He was an architect, among many other things. He designed the rotunda and many other buildings on campus. He designed the landscape of the university. He hired the earliest professors, and he even helped to write some of the institution's earliest curriculum. Think whatever you want about Thomas Jefferson, it's historical fact that he is a man who accomplished many things. And yet he only wanted 3 of those things mentioned on his gravestone. He left off that he was the 3rd president of the United States. He left off that he was the 1st Secretary of State. He left off that he was the 2nd vice president. He left off that he signed the Louisiana Purchase. The three things he wanted mentioned on his gravestone: he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and that he was the founder, or as he put, the father of the University of Virginia. Is it so crazy that an institution would have images of the person who is responsible for that institution's very existence? It's an open question, but not an easy one necessarily to answer. But I want to make it clear that this issue of monuments and memorials doesn't always go in one direction. I think this is really important. Case in point, in 2015, this bust of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger was protested and called for removal. This bust can be found at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And an association of ministers from all over the United States, many of whom are African American, they wrote an open letter to the National Portrait Gallery in 2015, the letter called Ministers Taking a Stand. They wrote, quote, "We demand that all images, statues, busts, and likenesses of any kind of Margaret Sanger be removed. Notwithstanding the fact that many of us are black, we are a national organization of pastors from various races and backgrounds, and we stand together in opposition to the racist and genocidal legacy of Margaret Sanger," end quote. Now, the connections that Margaret Sanger may have had with the eugenics movement of the early 20th century are murky at best. What we do know, because it's by her own account, is that she did speak to a group of women Ku Klux Klan members. She recounted as such in her autobiography. Quote, "Always to me, any aroused group was a good group, and therefore I accepted the invitation to talk to the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan at Silver Lake, New Jersey, one of the weirdest experiences I had in lecturing," end quote. I have no doubt about that. The issue here is not whether or not Margaret Sanger might have been a eugenicist or a racist. That's beside the point. I use this example to show you that these debates don't all go in one direction. You have different special interests calling for the removal of very different kinds of historical monuments. So finally, I get to this question. Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide these things about which historical figures should be given the sort of elevated status that monuments and memorials seem to invoke? Who owns history? The answer, of course, is that it's up to us, collectively, the living generation. And perhaps somewhat ironically, I think it's a quote by Thomas Jefferson that's actually very appropriate here. In a letter that he wrote in 1789 to James Madison, Jefferson said, "The earth belongs to the living. The dead have neither powers nor rights over it. The portion occupied by an individual ceases to be his when himself ceases to be, and reverts to the society." A decision regarding which monuments should go and which should stay, what historical figures should be revered and which shouldn't, and why, requires a level of historical literacy that's sorely lacking at the moment. I'm hoping that talks like this one today will add to that level of historical literacy. Because with issues like this, with controversial or supposedly controversial monuments and memorials, it almost matters less what side you end up on. What matters is that you have an informed view. And like I said, I hope talks like this will add to that level of historical literacy. Thank you very much. Do these controversies inform the public? I think they do to some extent. I think that the debates and the conversations cause some to investigate further, or somebody hears a crazy thing, they can't believe it's possibly true, and so they look into it, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So yeah, I think that's true. I think that can be true, but what's true at the same time is that we also live in a 24-hour cable news and social media culture where people are just as likely to think they're right as they are to investigate whether or not they're right. So I agree with you that, as far as I'm concerned, any conversation, almost any conversation is a good one. So yeah, I'm sure that for some people, this has informed their historical literacy by talking about these sorts of issues, certainly. I can't speak to his work on Grant. Maybe my criticism of Chernow is that he seems to like men at war He likes these sort of war figures like Grant, Hamilton, Washington. He utilizes, why he's interesting is he utilizes kind of that academic historian's discipline, but he chooses very popular history sort of subjects. And by doing so, there's some revisionism that happens. Certainly, maybe it's because a lot of my work has been on people like Jefferson, but until Chernow's book, and especially with LinManuel Miranda's play, Hamilton has turned into a sort of cultural figure and historic figure that he never was before. And Jefferson is now kind of in the shadows where it had been the opposite for so long. So as far as his recent book on Grant, I can't speak to it because I haven't read that, but I did read his Hamilton book and his Washington book. And they're very, very good, but there is a little bit of, not quite hero worship, but certainly, we all know this, like it says a lot about us in terms of what subjects we pick to study and to write about, and he seems to have a thing for, powerful military men. Yeah, and to give him props as a writer of popular history, if he had been too overly academic with his Hamilton book, it may not have been accessible for someone like LinManuel Miranda, who's a brilliant guy, but he's more likely to pick something that's on the bestseller list than some sort of arcane, obscure academic work. So Chernow I think we'll be dealing with the repercussions of Chernow's work for good and for bad for decades to come, probably.
Does anybody own history?
Well, that was my question, right?
That's your question.
The living generation is what owns history, it seems to me. That's the best that we can get to. But there's a danger in that, which is, does that mean that we burn everything down, that preceded us? And that's kind of the overly radical sort of look at it of starting the world over again and all that kind of stuff. So just as there are dangers to conservatism, there are dangers to overt radicalism. So I think that ownership of history really has to do with kind of balancing the two. For colonial and pre-colonial America, a really good writer and historian is Alan Taylor. He's actually the history department chair at University of Virginia, and he's done American Colonies is one of his works, and another one of his works that I read last summer, I can't think of it, but he delves a lot into the relationship of the intertribal relationships amongst Native Americans prior to and post European contact, and he's actually been really good, especially because he tackles things like that have not really been looked into that much, such as the life of the northeastern Native American nations during the War of 1812. There's all sorts of histories that have been overlooked for so long. I would maybe push back a little bit on the monument issue, only in the sense that I think there tends to be a tendency for us to look at all monuments being created equal. And I see a difference there, and it's fine to agree to disagree, but there are monuments to Jefferson and monuments to Washington despite them being slave owners. Those monuments were never put up because they were slave owners. Whereas Confederate monuments were put up because they were assertions of white supremacy. So like these Confederate monuments, most of them came up during the Jim Crow era. They're not so much relics of the Civil War as they are relics of the southern states reasserting white supremacist dominance. So I think you could argue, I have no problem with taking them down. I think it's very moral to do so. I'd like to see them in a museum or some sort of school or academic setting for them to be discussed, but I think that's a really important distinction. These Confederate monuments are relics of the Jim Crow South more than they are of the Civil War. And I think a lot of the people who live in these areas who have such monuments don't even understand that, which is unfortunate. But there's a reason why most of these monuments happened somewhere just after Reconstruction up through the 1920s. And that's when you have the kind of a reassertion of white supremacy, especially in the South. Public history is kind of the most complicated and tricky because whether you're talking about being on like a historic commission like I am, or if you're working in popular history in the realm of like working in museums or something, you're really working with a bit of academic history and popular history simultaneously. And because of that, you're trying to please both camps and yet really do your best to almost kind of challenge both camps simultaneously. And so it's really tricky. What we're doing here in town is pretty minor stuff. I'm the only sort of like academically minded historian on the commission, so and the fact that I worked for the university archives for a couple of years under Jerry Lee really helps my local history knowledge. So I'll usually insert something more kind of historic about the founding of Monmouth or the founding of the university, and something that I can kind of infuse into the commission about that, and we'll include that with what everybody else wants to do, which is a little bit more traditional, I suppose. I think the polarization will get worse as long as people on both sides are historically illiterate. I think those conversations are really important and really good to have when there's some reasonable level of historical literacy on both sides. But that means maybe some people in one camp accepting that like I said, not all monuments are created equal. Not all of them went up for the same reasons. And the other side doing something about being awfully slow about, defending. I've wrestled with this issue just internally a lot, and I cannot see any historical reason to defend a Robert E. Lee monument. Like, just on historical grounds, he was an enemy of the United States government. And then people after the fact wanting to put him up simply as a reassertion of white supremacist laws and whatnot. That's a little odd to me that anybody would defend that as well. So these conversations, I completely agree with Dr. Bray and Dr. Henkels that these conversations are really, really good to have, but debates are only as good as informed as the participants are. If neither camp is terribly informed on the issue, then debate for debate's sake doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. You really gave me an in, and I cannot thank you enough, because there's something I wanted to mention, and you opened the door for me. So yeah, I agree with you that maybe it can be said that it's more complicated than either one side is making it. Like one side is defending it outright, other ones kind of want to tear everything down outright, and there's probably something that's reasonable that's in between. With the Roger Tawney statue in Maryland, as I said, he's conflated with the Confederacy, though he wasn't a Confederate. He was culturally a Southerner and this, that, and the other, but that sort of conflation is a problem. And the fact that the Smithsonian is making that same mistake, and so somebody reads that and they're going to make the mistake because they read it in the Smithsonian, that's a problem. But what's really interesting is that the descendants of Roger Tawney and the descendants of Dred Scott in the past few years have started to have conventions with each other, and they meet up once a year. This guy responsible in no small part for the Civil War and questions over slavery, and this man whose very freedom had been left up to the Supreme Court. Their descendants are now coming together and talking to each other. And they actually, a couple of years ago, the two families lobbied the city of Annapolis, Maryland, about the Tawney Monument. And they both said, we don't want it to go. What we want is a Dred Scott statue to go next to the Tawney statue. And then you really have a conversation there.
Right.
But then the events in Charlottesville last summer made all of that impossible, and they just moved the monument. And so I agree with you that sometimes the best intentions cause a kind of erasure of history, an erasing of history. And that's not what anybody should want. And it would certainly draw more conversation, if what we want is conversation, to have a Roger Tawney statue and a Dred Scott statue in the same park and have them, interrelated. Well, it's a strange thing that some people do with history. That I minored in law, and so I have kind of a legalistic mind as well. And there's this thing in law which is like, it's kind of an absurdity, which is, well, that woman must have bad eyesight because she's a prostitute, right? One has nothing to do with the other, but people kind of do that with history, is that because Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, he did all of these horrific things, which is without question, then we can't admire the fact that he promoted a philosophy that helped unfold an actual emergence of more freedoms for more people. That's an irony that's hard for us to engage with, because it sounds like we're then absolving him for those other things when we're not. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you that it's much more complicated. This entire issue, because it happens in the United States, it's further complicated by the fact that we utilize federalism. We leave a lot of things up to the states and up to local jurisdictions to decide for themselves what they want to do. And we generally, in a lot of times, like, well, that school or that park is named after this guy that did these horrible things, but if that community, if that's what they want, is it for the United States federal government to say otherwise? And I don't know the answer to that. All right, thank you everybody very much.
Thank you.